In this event, we'll be focusing on API Lifecycle Management, specifically the approaches required to continually evolve APIs while retaining scalability and stability. To do so, we'll be exploring why a product management approach is so critical to the API lifecycle. But first, what exactly do we mean by API Lifecycle Management? Well, the API lifecycle can be thought of in multiple stages, from the design stage through development, documentation, maintenance, and eventual retirement. And at each point in this journey, certain roadblocks may present themselves. Therefore, lifecycle management helps bring more consistency and governance to each part of an API's life. So how do we implement this? Especially when a web API product's lifecycle can be a bit more complex than your typical software as a service. Well, to implement effective lifecycle management for APIs, an organization will likely require standardized definitions, internal style guides, and common versioning schemes. To do this consistently, a lot of organizations turn to an API management platform vendor, and there are numerous solutions throughout the market specializing in areas like monitoring, security, development, documentation generation, or monetization, and other areas. And a handful of these vendors offer all of these features in one package, which could be considered a complete lifecycle management solution. In general, though, if we're focusing on lifecycle management, it could bring a lot of benefits to an API strategy. For example, centralizing these efforts can help retain backward compatibility. It could help keep an active inventory to then avoid shadow APIs, and continually evolve services with the customer in mind. And this last note is something we're going to explore today, which is pretty important because it helps avoid breaking changes, since API consumers really heavily rely on stability of endpoints and their responses. There's a big catch-22 here because although REST designers strive to build APIs on the scale of decades, as Fielding would say, they must simultaneously respond to new digital demands. So I've given a super high-level overview of API lifecycle management in general and its benefits. And to dive deeper today, we've brought in two experts with a lot of knowledge in this field. First up, we'll be featuring Erik Wilde. Erik is a seasoned API technologist who runs a very successful YouTube channel called Getting APIs to Work, which I highly recommend our viewers to check out. And today, Erik will explain why we should take a product perspective to API management. Then we'll be hearing from Marjukka Niinioja. And Marjukka is the founder of Osaango Ltd, which offers services in the API and data economy. She's a business and technical consultant, speaker at API conferences, and co-author of the API Economy 101 book. Today, she'll discuss the consumer's perspective on API versioning. And after that, we're gonna open things for a brief Q&A. So for those of you tuning in live, please write in your questions into the chat throughout the event, and we'll try to take them after these two presentations. So thanks for being with us, Erik, and feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, okay, I will. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, sure thing.
And it's great to be on again. I think I was on one of these a little while ago, and it's great to be on again with Marjukka. And I try to avoid saying her last name because, like you, I stumble all the time.
I had to do a double check, and still.
I know it's not easy. Too many vowels for us. Yeah, so it's great to do that, and then we'll talk about API products today. Bill, I'm not sure you're sharing my screen, I think, or maybe I am not sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Sorry. Let me try again.
Yeah, I took off sharing, and I think you should be good to go.
Okay, good, very good. Yes, now I can see it, thanks. Yeah, so what I will do is I will talk a little bit more, I would say, about the why and the what. So why would you even do that, and what APIs are good candidates for actually doing kind of serious API lifecycle management? And Marjukka then will dive deeper into how to do it. And I think both things are important, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense if you do great API lifecycle management, but the APIs that you do it for are not really the best possible APIs that you could have. So I think it's important to really look at this bigger pictures, not just at how do I do lifecycle management, but also what do I just manage with that. And therefore, this is what I will focus on. And for this, to jump into this, what I will do is I will address 3 different areas. So I want to talk a little bit about why we even do this and which APIs can benefit, I would say, the most from really solid lifecycle management practices, because those will be the ones that are, let's say, most visible and most relevant for the business aspect of APIs. Then I want to dive a little bit deeper into the product aspect of things. So what does it mean to not just manage APIs, but to really look at them as products? And then last but not least, I also want to talk a little bit about that aspect that sometimes get a little bit forgotten when we talk about API lifecycle management, which sometimes I think focuses just on how do I do versioning, how do I make sure that things don't break and so forth. But it's also important that you find people who actually use your API. So focusing on API consumption, I think, is also something that is very important and that we see is a bigger and bigger focus on. So we will talk about this as well. So let's get started by looking at why do we even do this and what's the main reason, what APIs should we focus on. So when you look at which APIs are good candidates, then it's always a little tricky. You can look at APIs in 2 ways. So you can look at them more, let's say, as an technical aspect, where you say, well, I have 2 applications, I have 2 programs which are running, and I want to connect them, right? They should talk to each other. And that oftentimes will be an API. And if you look at it at this level, then the API mostly is an aspect of software architecture. It's just the question, how do I build software which for communicating components then uses APIs? And maybe also around practices, how I do that in the best possible way. But if you go about it this way, and we see that a lot actually, oftentimes what this ends up creating is that you have this project mindset where you say, well, I have something here, I have something here, I want to connect those things. And if I'm done with connecting those things, I'm happy. My job is done, right? This was my job as a software developer, to connect those 2 things to get this working. And that's fine at this level. But if you look at APIs from a slightly different perspective, this becomes something that is not necessarily the only or even the best way of doing things. Because if you look at it more where APIs are less about integrating things, so creating like one big thing made up of smaller interconnected components, but more about this idea of making things reusable, building reusable business components, so that, for example, when you need to build a new channel for your customers, if you need to build new features around products that you have, that it's easier to add on new features, to add new applications that are building on existing features that you have. And in that case, APIs are much more about the reusability, about having those one-to-end interconnections. And then it's not so much about software architecture, it's much more about business architecture. And what is important, and we don't have that much time to talk about this today, but is then you really have to think about what is the best possible way how I can take my business and split it into these components so that these components become reusable. And whenever from the business side of things, we say we want to do something different, we want to build new customer channels, we need to partner with new partners, that we need to give them access to something, then it becomes easier for you to do that. And if you look at things this way, then you much more get into this product mindset where you don't think about just, I need to get one thing done and then I'm done with it and I'll do whatever needs to be done next. But instead you think of this as, well, here is a capability that I need to expose so that from now on, this can be consumed by whoever needs to consume it. And the important part here really is, and it's maybe my goal for 2023 in every presentation that I have, maybe not every, but at least in some, to always mention the Spice Girls question. And the Spice Girls question, I think, is an excellent tool to allow you to figure out, is this API one of these business APIs? Is it something that exposes a business capability? Because in the end, one good way of thinking about APIs is to think about it, and maybe that sounds weird at first, but to say, nobody really wants APIs. Right? That may sound weird to you, but in the end, I think if you dig deep enough, nobody says, I want an API because that's what I want. The Spice Girls question says, tell me what you really, really want, right? What's the thing that you would like? What's the job to be done with that API? And if that job to be done is a business capability that you want to expose, then it makes a lot of sense to say, oh, that seems to be a pretty important API, because that is really exposing something that from the business side of things, people say, oh, this is a capability that we want to make reusable. We want to use it in new value chains and so forth. And that's a very good indication that for this API, it really makes sense to look at it as a product, to invest into lifecycle management, to design it carefully, and to really think through what it should mean for this capability to be exposed in a reusable way. So now we have a way to identify, let's say, some of these APIs that maybe need a little bit more care to be treated as products, to be designed in a way that lifecycle management works well for them, and so forth. And then we can ask ourselves, okay, now that we have identified those APIs, now what do we need to do? And I think it's always important to go back to the things that we actually talk about. So if we talk about API products, one of the things that you can really just do is think about, what is a product really? And one of the important things, and this is just Merriam-Webster's entry for product, one of the things that you can say about products in a very general way is that products are designed to be reusable, right? It's, if you read it literally, something such as a service that is marketed or sold as a commodity, meaning that it's not just something that is done for one, but something that is done for multiple consumers. And then you can think about, okay, so if I accept that, then what does it mean to be a good API? And what does it mean to be a good product, right? And one of the examples that I like to use, even though I know from certain perspectives, such as the ecological perspective, it's not a great idea to put this on a pedestal. But if you look at the Nespresso coffee capsules, right, I think they're really well-designed products. They're convenient, they create good coffee, they have a great marketing campaign around them. And it's just something which you can just tell by how successful they are, even though they are ridiculously expensive when you look at how much the coffee actually costs by weight, right? But they do all the check marks of what a good product is, right? They're well designed, they're designed with consumers in mind. What's the job that a consumer wants to get done? Easily make a good coffee, right? That's the main thing that people want to accomplish here. Then it's designed to be used by many consumers, right? Again, that's also for an API important, not just that one app that I built, but many different potential consumers. Then there's a product life cycle where you say, okay, this thing, for example, needs to live over a long period of time. By now, they actually even have kind of a reasonable program in place how you can recycle those thingies. But it is something where from a product perspective, right, you also want consumers that they can have some faith in this product, some reliability in it, that they say, oh, it makes sense for me to start using this product because I trust that this will not create too many problems for me down the road. And also, to be a good product, you need to be findable and consumable in an easy way, right? So that's something we look at a little bit later. And then also, you need to make sure that people know it exists. So you need to invest in marketing. And what all of this tells us, I think, is that even though we read and hear a lot about developer experience nowadays, where people are saying, oh, the most important thing about APIs is a good developer experience, right? So you have an API and you have the developer working with the API. So clearly there needs to be some care to design it so that the developer can use the API easily. And it's totally true, no doubt about this. But we also need to think about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture not just includes the developer, it also includes what does this product, the API, actually deliver, right? What is the service that is encapsulated in the API? Can the developer then build good apps with it so that my API gets used because the developers were able to develop good apps with it? So that's important. And if we zoom out even further, another thing that's also important is to say, oh, and by the way, it's not enough that my API is useful for the developer and allows to build useful apps for the consumers. It also needs to drive value for my organization. And this is what we looked at in the very beginning. What is the underlying business goal of this API? Because only if in the end, your API actually is valuable for your organization, only then it makes sense to invest a lot into it. And that is something that you hopefully can somehow verify. And keep in mind, being valuable for your organization doesn't necessarily mean just monetary value in terms of it generates money. It can also mean that it helps your organization to accomplish its mission. So if your organization, for example, is a nonprofit organization, well, then you will have some mission where you maybe want to make information available or you want to help people to get something done more easily. And whatever it is that you can come up with where an API helps with that, right? Then this is an API that helps your organization to accomplish its goals. And then this is what you really should take seriously as an API that you need to manage as a product, that needs to have a serious lifecycle management behind it so that this API can then realize its value in the best possible way. And then we have one last thing to look at, which is not just making sure that you have those APIs where you believe that they create value for your users and for your organization, but also to make sure that you maximize the exposure. How easily can people even find it? And this is something, again, it's basically just from the product playbook, right? If you have a product, hopefully you have designed the product with a market in mind, more than one consumer, right? Basically, more than one consumer means you address a market. And that means that now you have to think about how do I maximize the usage of my product in the market that I designed for. And that means that you have to think about what that market is, then you have to address that market. And when it comes to thinking about what should I mainly invest in when it comes to picking the APIs that I really want to market, right? Then some of the core capabilities of your organization are very good candidates. So for example, let's say for some generic product organization, right? APIs for things such as ordering, for delivery, for invoicing. These things should be very easy to find and easy to use. And more we see these marketing activities going into action where you say you try to actively make sure that people know that you have these APIs. And we see things such as portals, such as this is from a German bank where organizations are investing pretty heavily into creating those marketing, either marketplaces or portals, whatever you want to call them. And more we see kind of a blueprint of an architecture emerging. And the blueprint looks like this. I don't want to go into the details, but like this piece in the middle where you have an API catalog. And that API catalog on the one hand is independent of where the APIs are actually created and technically managed in the organization. And this API catalog is also independent of how the APIs then get marketed to specific markets, such as maybe the public or partners or internally, right? And the better you are in creating this architecture of APIs and how you manage them, the more flexible you are in managing them in your organization. And this is something where we see that there's a whole new crop of organizations popping up that have that just focus on that aspect, right? On creating portals or marketplaces or catalogs, whatever you call these things. There are various names around this, but the idea always is to have this centralized component that allows you to build this kind of this structure that we see here in this picture. So if we look at all these things together, right? So if we are looking about how we can get the most out of API product management and where we should invest when it comes to lifecycle management, I think we can just summarize what we went through by saying we should probably focus on APIs that are well aligned with business strategy and goals. We should make sure that we treat these APIs as products and with good lifecycle management in place. And we should then also invest in marketing to make sure that we get the most out of the products that we have identified and that we are managing in our lifecycle solution. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much. If you want to look at the slides, they're online. I'm sure Bill will make the link public, but the link is also in my latest Twitter and LinkedIn posts. And if you want to find out more about myself, you can find me on Twitter, YouTube, or LinkedIn. And with that, I'll hand it back to Bill, and I'll see you later in the Q&A session. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you, Erik. A lot of great insights there on what it means to create APIs and productize them and such. I similarly agree. I'm seeing like that emphasis on the centralized catalog, and then it's interesting how marketing can just interpret that in different ways.
Yes.
I'm hoping Marjukka will have some parallels on the marketing side of things and with the developer experience side of things as well. So yeah, let's hand the reins over to her and then do that Q&A afterward.
You have some tough expectations. and also I can just say that you can refer to me as the lady who runs the API Days Helsinki and North, or has created API cycles like the Australian bank guys in the conference, because they were having problems pronouncing my name. So that works just fine too.
Perfect. I'll use that title.
Yeah. I'm used to this. Anyway. So am I okay to share my slides now?
I think if you jump, yeah, it'll just transfer over.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay.
So trying to answer all the expectations set to me by Erik and Bill. Thanks, guys. But so the right way to version your APIs from the consumer's perspective, and I promise you, this is not going to be, should you put your version number in the URL path or in a query parameter. I'm kind of addressing that too, but this is much more on a bigger scale. But I hope you can get some practical advice that you can actually put into use. What I'm going to talk about today is your API versioning strategies may depend on the pace of the business, yours and your customers or partners. So what industry you are in and what are your APIs actually connected to, like cars or machine learning algorithms. The relationships and the perceived change that your API consumers will have are actually much more important than what the change is and was it versioned. Like you might be introducing some changes accidentally or in purpose that wouldn't even show in a version number change, but are actually impacting the consumers. I have some examples. And then the tool capabilities that you are using, but also what the API consumers are using will actually dictate a lot on your use of version numbers, but also on the whole, your whole versioning strategy. And if like this is the name of the game, really, that if a feature in your API isn't used, it can't break. So that's, if you can't take anything else out of this, please take that. And then when you're thinking of your overall company strategy, business strategy, product strategy, service strategy, and your API strategy, those usually should have some kind of alignment. It's not always totally straightforward what that alignment is, but there can be some trends that we are seeing of the transition, what happens when an organization kind of first started out with APIs and then moves further in the thinking and then gets more mature. So that will be the conclusion. And in case you're wondering why some of the pictures might seem so strange or beautiful, however you kind of perceive it, these are created with OpenAI DALL-E and also a human member of my team at Osaango. And Bill already did a wonderful job introducing me, so not so much about me, but we're working as part of the API Collective, so we have a global presence, although physically I'm sitting in Finland right now, and we're helping clients all over the world with their API business modeling, API design, API product management, and a lot of other things related to APIs and business. Now, when you're Googling API versioning or API versioning strategy, what you get usually is a lot of stuff about, should you put your version numbers, should you use version numbers, should you put them in a path, in URL, in header, in content, and what are all the fancy technical things that will have impact too. And then the problem with those is that it leaves the scene a bit open. It kind of like, the blogs often end up with, well, you could do this, or you could do that, or you could do whatever, and probably you shouldn't even version, but nobody actually discusses that much about what is the impact to your API consumers and your business with a different versioning strategy, and on the other hand, what is the impact of your business and your consumers to how you can do versioning. So I think that's an important thing to understand, and all those people who have been doing things for years and decades in the business probably have dealt with a lot of this already, but I think that just putting things into an organized presentation might help. So at least for me personally, hopefully you guys too. So in reality, API versioning strategy often depends on a strategic level. It depends on the product management strategy. It depends on the pace of the business and industry, on the relationships and perceived change, and tools and capabilities. So I'm going to be looking at these individually in a moment. What do these mean in practice? But just to kind of set the scene, that once upon a time, I was in a SaaS company and I left, I think, 7 years ago, something around that. And they are still using the same version number for the API. And I decided it back in the days, it's version number 1.5. And the reason why it was 1.5 was that when we made our new API, like a completely revamped API, nothing to do with the previous one, somewhere in 2014, we were gradually starting the work with the most important endpoints that we had asked our API consumers, our customers at the time, and our partners, what are you expecting us to release first? And everybody said time reporting. That is the most important thing, and specifically these endpoints, these features, we need these. And so we decided then that this is going to be a long journey. We have a whole roadmap of like, what are the priorities? And then we'll just keep adding. We won't remove anything unless we are absolutely having to. And we'll just keep adding and adding and adding. And somewhere along the line, the API will be so-called ready, because everybody kept asking, especially our CEO kept asking, when is this API going to be ready? And I was so fed up with the questions that I decided that it's going to be called 1.5, because that is going to keep everybody expecting that there's going to be a 2.0 and then it will be ready. And I made a personal bet when that is going to happen, and it still hasn't. So let's see. And they haven't been breaking a lot of things in the meanwhile, so that's good too. So the pace of the business is one of the key things that actually decides how you should be versioning your API. So what kind of changes should you be making and how often? And is the market and are your API consumers demanding rapid change, or are they completely against it? Or for example, if you are in certain industries, like let's say cars or healthcare devices or something like that, you might not be able to make any changes because of regulatory compliance or because the devices are actually nowhere to be updated with. So whatever API version is going with the shipment of a device, it's just going to be there because there's no way to update it, or it's going to be very difficult. So there are totally different kind of mindsets and different expectations with the API consumers on how much, how often, and how forced can the changes be. So can you kind of say to your consumers that, hey, we are now going to change this API, live with it, make your changes, it's going to go away. Is that going to work or not is a good question. And it really depends on the relationship that you have with the API consumers. So it's all about, in a way, power structures. So if your API consumers depend on you, you can actually dictate when they will change versions. And if they are actually more powerful and influential or louder or able to take their social media and kind of have a Twitter storm or something around you if you change your API and they didn't like it, then you really need to be careful in making changes. I remember in a retail company, for example, I mean, it's not banking or anything super serious, but retail is still related to money, but it's also related to really good relationships between the customers and the retail shop, of course, but also the partners and the whole ecosystem. And there was a really big kind of barrier to change. And there were even times in the year that you couldn't make a change to anything, not let alone an API. And of course, there are finance sectors and healthcare and a lot of other sectors where you just cannot make changes unless there's like somebody signing off a lot of papers for you to be able to do that. And that means that a highly regulated industry is, of course, one area where you will have issues. But the even more important thing is, as I mentioned, sometimes that the API consumers can perceive some things as a breaking change, even if you didn't intend it to be. And if they didn't notice you making a change, it wasn't a change. And if you can make sure that nobody will notice, or at least if you can make sure that you have the data to back you up that nobody should be right now using this or never has used this or it never worked as intended anyway, then you're probably okay making the change. So these are kind of two questions I would like you to kind of ponder a bit and maybe put your inputs into the chat if you have opinions, but these are from real cases. One is from our client who was using a third-party API, and they actually got one day this major breakdown of one of their systems because a third-party API provider had suddenly changed their authentication method of the API from an API key to OpenID Connect. And when the client of ours was angry and emailed to the API provider support, the support answered with an email saying, well, we didn't make a change to the API, we just changed the authentication method. I'm resting my case here. I don't have comments, but if somebody does that, please do. But I mean, I understand their logic in it. I understand that they were not changing the design of the API, but obviously this was a breaking change. And not only they were changing the authentication method, but they forgot to provide the new authentication credentials to the API consumers. And of course, they also forgot to inform about the change. So everything that could go wrong went wrong. But this next one was kind of a weird one in a way, but actually more common than you would think. So an education platform was not changing anything in the interface, but they were actually suddenly outputting more data about new user groups in the same endpoint that was already in use. And this was noticed when some of the users of a third-party mobile app were suddenly noticing that they were seeing people's names and email addresses and whatever that they should not have been seeing. And when this came out in the press, then the API provider shut down the API completely, which basically left the mobile app provider hanging because their business was basically gone, at least for a while. And that was, of course, not nice for them. They were not necessarily to be blamed. On the other hand, you could always say that they should have been probably testing all the time and more carefully, but still it was just basically somebody switched on a tap of data and suddenly there was more there than should have been. So this was not an interface change. This was not a code change. How should we handle this kind of a change? And how should we handle it in a kind of versioning strategy or version number? That's why I'm trying to say here that sometimes the discussion focuses too much on where to put your version number, when actually there are lots of things that can change. Even the documentation can change, even if there's no change in the API itself. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a change. So, yeah, I think the tools and capabilities is an interesting one, because again, if a company is using an API management tool, gateway, portal, something, they can be quite picky on what kind of versioning strategies they support. Some are very product centric. Not many, but for example, IBM was one of the first that was really kind of focusing on the product subscriptions and actually really kind of versioning on a product level, which was an interesting take at the time. But some just support, for example, URLs or headers, and then you just need to go with that. But on the other hand, the more important thing is what can your consumers deal with? Because if you have a lot of legacy systems, integration tools, kind of very lightweight marketing applications, for example, they usually cannot handle anything else than version numbers in URL and nothing more complex if you have to version at all. On the other hand, I would say that you should always have at least that one version, so it's clear, but changing that version number for years is not necessarily at all necessary thing, because every time you change your version number or make a very small change to an API that forces everybody to do a change, even if they are not using any of the new things or change things that you are introducing, they still have to change their code, and sometimes they just can't do it because they don't have knowledge or access to the code anymore, or if they don't have the budget, resources, or anything else, then you are just harassing your API consumers for nothing. And that goes down to the team's capabilities. So whoever is managing the API, developing the API, they need to be very good at preventing, introducing, breaking changes. They need to do really good quality. They have to research the customer or the API consumer needs. They need to know the data, and they need to even think about the future needs. And unfortunately, this is not always the case that we see. And especially if there's no product manager involved with the APIs, this is often not happening in a proper way. Some of the last points. So the product management side and the kind of overall strategy. This is an interesting one because we work quite a lot with finance institutions, but also with very heavy duty technology, machinery, and kind of like very product, like hardware, physical product kind of companies. And even SaaS companies kind of have the same problem, that you might start with a kind of our company's API. So you have a few endpoints, you put them all in one API, and then you maybe end up with a product specific API because suddenly you realize your company has more products than one. And then you realize, oh no, actually this API only fits this product version, or only this product. And then you come up with multiple versions of APIs because of the different product versions. So at some point, this leads you to hopefully realize that there are some endpoints that are common to many products, and there are some that are limited only to specific API consumer segments, even though they're belonging to the same, for example, physical product or SaaS product or something. And they should actually have different pricing. If you're monetizing your APIs, different pricing than the other endpoints. So you actually start splitting your API into API products, and you do it according to value propositions or use cases or jobs to be done, according to the value propositions, all linked together. And one way to do that, if you're kind of struggling with the idea of how to do this, you are not used to thinking in a product management set, or your team or your organization is, then I give you a hint. So the API cycles is an open method that allows you to do that and helps you, guides you through the process. And a lot of companies, a lot of organizations around the world are currently using it and adopting it. Some of the interesting things I'm hearing, for example, from Netherlands, is that there's a safe plus API cycles thing going on, and we see a lot of adoption in our clients. But really, this product mindset thinking, which includes the value propositions thinking, is a key to splitting the atom, kind of making sure that you have valuable bits and pieces, which you can then totally throw away when that value is not anymore needed to be created, because sometimes the world changes around you. Sometimes the consumer API consumer needs change completely, or a feature or a service or something is removed. So I think this is one of the key things we see in the evolution of the whole API lifecycle and how it evolves over time. So about the API cycles method, you'll find more info in the apicycles.com site, but it is an open and lean method, and it really is collaborative method that you can use with business and product and technical experts. So that's the kind of very useful thing about it for this kind of API consumer first thinking. Okay, that was all from me, except a lot of questions, please, so we can answer them.
Yeah, Marjukka, love your presentation. Erik and I were nerding out in the chat over random API theories and laws. And I don't know if all of our listeners are aware, but there is one that kind of covers a lot of what you're saying, and it's called Hirams Law. And it talks about the implicit interface. So I pulled up the definition just to have it here with us. So it states that with a sufficient number of users of an API, it doesn't matter what you promise in the contract, all observable behaviors of your system will be depended on by somebody. Yeah. And you exactly hit on that. It's like, if you change the authentication, that could cause breaking change. Yeah. If you change the response size or the way it's formatted, even that could cause breaking change.
Yeah, but that's the key, that to avoid the Hirams Law kicking in as much as possible, you really need to be only releasing features and attributes and everything that you absolutely know someone is going to use. Like the worst thing is that you just have a big database of stuff and you just for, in case somebody will need this, you will, expose everything in the first go in the API, which has been happening. And that's the point. Do not do that. Otherwise, the Hirams Law is really going to kick in.
Yeah. And the whole idea of like, if a feature in your API isn't used, it can break or it can't break. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost like an inverse Hirams Law,
Yeah.
No one's using it, then no harm done. But I feel like, I don't know, that could be a dangerous assumption at sometimes, like if you don't have the data to back it up and if you're not monitoring. So how do you recommend going about that and making sure that you know, hands down, this isn't being depended upon by someone?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have data about how your API is used. So, for example, that 1.5 API example, I was like really deep diving to the analytics. At the time, we didn't have, like, it was so early in the world that there wasn't really a lot of API management solutions around. But we were a SaaS company, so we of course wanted to build our own anyway. So, but the point was that we still had data. And without the data, we couldn't have done things. Sometimes, of course, you end up with a situation that you just don't have data yet, and you have a bunch of users, you don't have a clue what to do. So, for example, with a US company, Rev.com, we were just doing it basically so that we had to have the product manager just do a survey among all the users, because it was a case of a really long-standing API, and now it needed to be redesigned. So that was just the case. I see Joyce has a question there.
Yeah, we could take that for you.
Yeah, so
here, I'll just read it so people have it in the recording. Is there a right time to introduce your consumers to versioning? My own personal take is the pain it causes could prove difficult to retrofit when you need it. And a counter argument is that, why bother customers with this at all, with the overhead of learning about versioning until you really need to.
I kind of agree with Joyce, because I would say that, or what I said in the presentation was that you do need to have kind of like that version 1, so that in case something happens, you can indicate that there's now a kind of breaking change. But if you don't have any kind of tool that forces you to go to some specific direction, then go with the version number in the URL way, because that is guaranteed to work with everybody everywhere, if anything will work. But that doesn't mean that you have to ever change it. So it's just a kind of backup there. And then you should not deprecate anything. Like there was a question about the deprecation, if Erik wants to comment on that. But
yeah, let's bring Erik into this some more. We'll love your thoughts here.
So there's the answered question too. So
yeah,
for the deprecation part. Yeah, so I mean, deprecation, I think that's all. I think that's, for example, one of the things that for lifecycle management still doesn't. A lot of times people don't really think about deprecation when they start an API, and I think that should be always like part of your plan from the very beginning. You know, it's like every API is going to be discontinued at some point. And how are we going to do this? Will we know who uses it? Can we even talk to them? Do we have their contact address? Can we maybe communicate it through the API itself? So there are definitely different ways how you can do it. I posted one possibility in the answer, basically to this HTTP header field that you can use. It's just one way of doing it. But I think what's important is more that you kind of have this list of, have we even thought about this for this API? So that from the very beginning you say, oh, you know, and we also should have some plan how we deprecate this thing and how we switch it off. So that it gets safer for us to do that.
And if I can have a quick comment on that, I would definitely use, for example, the HTTP header thing in open data APIs, where for some reasons public sector insists specifically to release open data APIs that don't have any API keys and anything, because people think that that is going to need some privacy information and that's going to be a problem. Not going deep into that, but just disagreeing. But in case you have released for any reason an API where you just don't have any way of contacting people who are using it, then the header thing is nice. The problem with that is only that a lot of the tooling that people are using is totally unaware of headers at all, or just miss it or whatever. But at least you tried. that's
I mean, that's the thing, right? At least you can tell people that this is the way how it's going to be, and then if they miss it, I mean, they still will be angry and things will break. But such as
Ari, I know you have an accounting system in your hands, so I think so. The point is that with anything finance relating, you have to just plan for support the old API for like a few years, even in some cases. Of course, in some other cases, it's just not possible. But given that we are, for example, having in Finland this e-invoicing standard Finvoice, and it has been people are forced to support the old versions of it like for, I don't know, 5 years or even more. So that's life.
I guess it really comes down to the sector you're working within, the constraints there, and maybe some of it has to do with that power struggle you were referencing earlier. I think that was kind of interesting. I wanted to pose that question to Erik. Like, have you seen that influencing how the life cycle evolves with APIs at all?
Could you rephrase that question once again?
So I explained that the power struggle in the terms of if you have a very important, loud, or otherwise, a big bad API consumer that says that no, we don't want to change.
It's like, can consumers actually direct change from the provider?
And there again, right? I mean, sometimes I think it's just interesting to look at all the different patterns. So for example, when you look at what Salesforce is doing, right? They're kind of isolating consumers by saying every version gets released and is never changed, right? So you never even have this problem of having to create breaking changes, because you just promise to everybody, if you subscribe to version whatever, that's going to stay the same, not forever, right? I mean, they have a certain time, and then after a certain time, those versions get deprecated, and eventually they get shut down. But on the Salesforce side of things, right, they have so many consumers that for them it makes sense, I guess. It's probably not trivial, because by now I don't know how high the number is now. The last time I heard a number, I think it was somewhere in the 30s, like 30 something parallel versions of an API that they were operating.
Wow.
And this is quite a bit of operational cost.
On the other hand, have a lot of money to do.
Well, it's Salesforce, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and maybe, you know, if you have millions of consumers, right? I mean, maybe that's a really good investment to make and say, okay, yes, that's operationally expensive, but in terms of satisfying our customers, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah. But
It's
for
kind of
example,
also-
if I can quickly comment, like the opposite direction is that, for example, Twitter and Netflix have basically said, we just discontinue the APIs. Sorry, guys, but, you know, it's ending now. And, you know, all the
They're not even saying that. They're just switching it
yeah, they were
off.
just switching it off,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
So that's a power play on the opposite direction.
Yeah, they're like, we never promised we were a good company for the long term. I'm just gonna turn this off. But it kind of, on the inverse, it reminds me of some things that Google's doing, like with their Google Enterprise APIs. I don't know if you guys saw that in the headline.
It's really interesting, right?
Yeah.
I think, you know, that now it's kind of an enterprise API to some extent. I think technically speaking, it doesn't really mean anything. It's more that Google says, we understand that for some people, this is probably a little bit more important. So we'll be more careful.
Yeah. But so, their product strategy, to make my point on the product strategy side, they have always done it so that they release new products and then they just can go away at some point. And I think it suits them to do the same thing with the APIs as long as people are aware of that. So because the point is, if your relationship is built on kind of an outspoken assumption of how things will work, that's fine. Or if your terms and conditions are saying this is how we'll operate, that's fine. But if you just release an API out there, or if you use an API and you don't know how things are going to go, then that's not good. Then
do either of you see like reliability in this way as a new value proposition within the API economy?
I think a lot of our clients and a lot of the discussion I'm seeing is going forward to the kind of SLAs and all kinds of, like, because for example, in certain industries, you have this kind of a chaining effect of like a lot of different products having APIs that are actually dependent on each other. So there's a lot of like this mutual destruction kind of thinking that if we go down, then everything goes down, and then everybody's going to blame us and we get to pay like all the big money because, you know, nobody got out of the building, or, you know, something really bad happens.
But I think people are getting more aware of that, right? So now there's like, when you look at API metrics, right? I mean, their business model is basically, as far as I can tell, just to let you better understand what the SLA sort of in the end is of certain APIs. And that can be really interesting because the promises that some companies make may not really match up with what you actually get. So having that as some kind of analytics, right? Third-party analytics that really tell you, look, this is how this API behaved in the last, I don't know, 3 months, right? That may be interesting also so that you better understand how do I really want to depend on this, or, you know, like, how risky is it?
Well, I think that's good to monitor because those slight changes could actually cause breaking changes. Like if you're building an application that depends on a certain response time or latency, any like change in that could have effects that are breaking change.
Yes, and then there's the thing, I think in the finance and accounting systems game, there's a lot of this kind of maximum capacity thing, because a lot of finance operations are dependent on end of day, end of month, or some other kind of deadlines, end of year, and then everybody's going to use the system at the same time at that moment. So then there's the kind of like the API might have a good SLA in a way, but then there are these peak times when things that just happen, and if you don't actually, like, according to the value proposition, if you don't place the APIs into kind of different buckets in terms of SLA and the peak hours, then you have problems. Like if you have, for example, some reporting APIs that are not so important for this end of whatever it is things, then you could just basically either shut them down or just have a reduced availability for them for a moment, or do something else that you kind of allow the capacity go where it needs to go. But a lot of times, because you are just building one big API and not separating these value propositions, then you are in trouble.
Right. Yeah, I'm also curious about like standards for these sort of reliability methods that we're talking about. And Erik, you kind of like pose that blueprint of the API catalog in the center, and it's kind of marketed differently to different stakeholders. I'm curious, you think, is that like the moment to apply this sort of standardization for you know, versioning and API evolution?
It's probably not a bad idea. I mean, all these standards, I wouldn't call them standards. It's always like, this always sounds too rough for some people, but at least having some guidelines or whatever you want to call them, right? Different people are using different names to make it a little bit more palatable, but that doesn't really matter. But I think at least also just in terms of making people aware of, you know, have you thought about this? And maybe if you haven't, here's one way of how you can do it. And then the question is like, how do you really build out this governance systems around that? Is there something where you say you have to do it this way, or you just tell people, well, do you want to do it this way? And probably also depends on and what API you're looking at. But just generally speaking, having this framework where it becomes easier for developers, and it's kind of like a good old saying from, I think, software development, right? It should be easy to do the right things, and it should be hard to do the wrong things. So the easier you make it for API designers and developers to do the right thing, the more that's what they will do. And then you have to decide, okay, and how, you know, how much of a stick do we have to keep them from doing the wrong thing? And that depends on your constraints. But I think in a lot of large organizations now, we see that they look into API programs, API platforms, API governance, whatever label you put around this. But these are all basically structures that help organizations to treat APIs in a more systematic and more scalable way. And I think that is something that is happening in larger organizations now, pretty much everywhere in some shape or form. Some things are a little bit earlier on, some things are a little bit later, but
that's what we are seeing. And that's kind of the point, that sometimes people treat these things as if you have the whole world is your oyster, but actually it isn't. You are very kind of constricted with what is the industry, what is the product strategy, all the things that I mentioned. You just build a set of questions and a checklist and a guidelines to your company to kind of make sure that everybody is only focused on those things that they can change and can decide, and not go around wondering a lot of things that they can't change anyway. So I think that's the important bit.
Erik, I'll add one more label to your list: an API Center of Excellence. I've seen that being used as well.
Yeah, center of, by now you don't say center of excellence anymore. You say center for enablement, because the excellent part is too top down. But yes, C4E, whatever you call these things. Yes, this is another label Cool. So it's kind of all like what Arno now, I think Arno Lore, he mostly decides to talk about governance. And I think that's a sufficiently fuzzy label that you can apply to many other things, but I think it's all kind of that general space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground so far in this hour. I really appreciate both of you for sharing your time. Great presentations, and a lot more to explore in future Nordic APIs events and on our blog as well. So I think if we're wrapped up there, I'm gonna just do some closing slides.
And sorry, Bill, but I will have to leave. I'm a little late for my next thingy. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for sticking
around. Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
So first off, some big news from Nordic APIs. we're very excited to announce that the 2023 Platform Summit is back. It's going to be held in October in Stockholm. And the flagship Nordic APIs Platform Summit gathers the brightest minds in the API industry to further the art of designing high quality, secure API platforms. So get this date on your calendar. And we have also opened up our call for speakers and really look forward to hearing from you about that. So you can find out more information about the call for speakers, as well as sponsorship opportunities and tickets, of course, on our website. And I always like to remind people that we have a blog that's open for submissions from people within the API community. If they would have, interesting insights to share and want a platform to do so, I'm happy to review new article submissions. You can learn about that at our website /create-with-us. And then if you don't already, highly recommend checking out our newsletter. This is a bi-weekly digest of some high quality blog posts that we put together here at Nordic APIs. And we have a lot of great writers working on that. And lastly, thank you so much to our sponsor, Curity. You can learn about their identity and access management solutions and API security products at curity.io. All right, that's all for now. Thank you.